Day 695 of the Ukrainian War Map, also known as the Russo-Ukrainian War. Juzzy here, and today is another update as I take a simplified and down-to-earth approach to some of the most important happenings on the ground in Ukraine. So starting off, we'll take a look at those Russian losses, as currently Russia sits on more than 374,000 military personnel losses, representing an additional 920 in the past day. Then as for hardware losses, 20 tanks, 35 APVs, and 19 artillery. With once again dealing with dozens of pieces of heavy equipment losses in a single day. Then we'll head across to the map and we'll start out in the Russian oblast of Bryansk, as a large fire broke out at the oil depot in Litsky after being attacked by a Ukrainian drone. According to the information of the regional governor, several oil tanks are burning. Then in a similar vein, a Ukrainian drone targeted an oil depot in St. Petersburg. Ukraine's Minister of Strategic Industries acknowledged the drone's origin and range covered, stating, quote, "Yes, we hit the target tonight. It's made in Ukraine, and this thing flew exactly 1,250 kilometers." Now, so far, sources did not yet disclose the type of drone or its payload size, but did cheekily say that it was carrying treats. And also that it flew over Putin's Valdai residence, which is another cheeky little remark. Then moving back south into Russia, as an electrical substation near Stary Oskol in northern Belgorod is no more. Although no word on any drone event, and it may have been just yet another isolated infrastructure fault of Russia's. Also, it just happens to look horrifically like a Hollywood portrayal of the commencement of a nuclear reaction. Scary stuff. Then we take a chilling look at some of the cool events in Russia, particularly with Novosibirsk. With those formerly reported heating infrastructure defects, as per what the local authorities called it the other day, has actually gotten worse now, as there are even more burst heating mains, with about 2,500 buildings now without heat, which equates to approximately 500,000 people without heating. Now, reportedly, the residents of the city wanted to organize a demonstration against the collapsing utility sector. However, the city authorities did not allow it. It's almost as if the citizens in this case were asking for permission to do so. The vice mayor of the city also stated that the protests would only lead to the threatening of civil and human rights and threats to public safety. But half the city is without heating right now at the coldest time of year. So aren't we already long past a threat to public safety? Oh, but also spare a thought for the 20 to 30% of Russians that don't have indoor plumbing, instead living with that outhouse lifestyle. But of course, the larger point to all of these poor infrastructure related events in Russia is really all about the government of Russia, with all its energy wealth, that could have easily provided better conditions to its population, which turns out the government has been not really prioritizing even basic necessities for its countrymen. Therefore, it becomes a question of just how long will the citizenry put up with these types of conditions. Then we'll head back across to the Ukrainian map today, as Russian forces have launched a new series of assaults in the Bakhmut direction, with fighting taking place practically along the entire front line. For instance, at Bodanivka, at Krimova, at Ivaniska, Klishchivka, and Andrivka. Although so far, this direction looks more or less the same for the last few weeks, since about the middle of December, with no real Russian gains on the map, but I expect the Russian military's Eastern Command, which is in charge of the Bakhmut and Avdiivka directions, are going to ramp up their attacks for some extra land gains, albeit at the cost of so many Russian lives and pieces of equipment lost. And speaking of Pyrrhic victory attempts, we'll move to Avdiivka, where Russian forces took a chunk out of the industrial zone in the southeast. Well, rather, it was roughly zero point 0.1 square kilometers taken out of the grey zone, to be precise. Oh, then also taking an inside look into the Avdiivka front with an interview with frontliners from this very region who gave some interesting insights to what's actually happening on the ground from the Ukrainian perspective. For instance, they talk about how the infantry meat waves from the Russian side keep coming like it's World War I, and only to meet their maker in the process from various Ukrainian fire, including drone drops, artillery fire, and FPVs. And the Ukrainian soldiers are almost shocked at how these Russian infantry units are motivated to walk forward into these treacherous and well-controlled Ukrainian territories. But ultimately, one AFU soldier says that death awaits them from both behind and in front, referring to the Russian soldier infantry attacks. And also on how Russian commanders are ready to fire on any deserters, which we know very well. And I would also argue that the Russian commanders bring in new unsuspecting batches for the infantry meat waves and paint a much rosier picture of events for what lies ahead of them. That is until they walk over their fallen comrades. What a ridiculous 21st century army. Then, somewhere in the east, Ukrainian operators are successfully mining the Russian backlines. As we see here, we have 4 Russian soldiers standing around in the aftermath from a side hit destroying their vehicle. So as you can see, the integration of anti-tank mines into defensive strategies can massively slow down an offensive force. And it's fair to say that Ukraine is leaps and bounds in front of Russia when it comes to mine clearing platforms and operations, such as through the use of the Leopard tank-based mine clearers, which looks like something out of your nightmares. But Ukraine is also getting quite high-tech with its mine clearing endeavors too, using drone, munitions or drops, and also thermal imagery for detection. Whereas Russian soldiers, well, so far, they are the mine clearers. Then also, somewhere in the east, I believe this one was near Avdiivka, another destruction of a Russian T-72B3 variant, so one of the latest variants of the tank, an abandoned tank in fact. Now, interestingly, the author points out that the Russians used this previously abandoned tank as a munitions storage device, so perhaps nobody warned them about the Russian tank turret vulnerabilities. Then moving south to the Sea of Azov as well, because I ran out of time yesterday, to mention about an internal Russian source stating how Putin was very angry after hearing about the downed Russian A-50 $330 million radar plane. And so angry that he started throwing around or breaking chairs and shouting at Shoigu. He then demanded strikes on the Kyiv capital and special forces sent to Kharkiv. So basically, Putin is threatening or calling for more military action in Ukraine. It's not much of a threat, really. But even more problematically, I would say, if Putin is breaking chairs and yelling at his generals, it's just going to create a larger communication gap and divide between him and his Ministry of Defense, where he's only going to get further drip-fed just the good news, thus making for quite an inaccurate understanding of what's really happening on the ground, on the battle space. Downfall vibes? Anyone? Then we'll briefly move across to the southwest with a Russian Mr. S self-propelled howitzer destroyed by an AFU FPV drone on the south bank of the Dnipro River. Then also some instant karma, as a Russian Grad that was firing at or into civilian locations in the Mykolaiv region was steadfastly destroyed after Ukrainian aerial reconnaissance in the Kherson sector picked it up and ordered an FPV drone to take it out. Then, just briefly as well, we'll move across to Crimea as blackouts were reported in the region, including at Simferopol, Sevastopol, Feodosia, Jankoy, and Saki. Russian-installed officials of the occupied peninsula said that the outage was due to an emergency shutdown of a power plant, but later stated that the power had been restored. Then nearby, it was also noted that a floating crane was deployed for additional protection in Sevastopol by the Russian Navy. And for this one, the hope would be to protect against air and naval threats for key strategic Russian naval port assets. So you see, Russia can either go home or die trying. Then we'll head across to some news for today. So, as part of the recent French military aid package to Ukraine, France will also be sending its AASM Hammer glide munitions. Now, these are air-launched, precision-guided strike weapons with a specified range of up to 50 kilometers or about 30 miles, and most impressively, France has committed to Ukraine sending 50 AASM Hammers per month throughout 2024. Then moving across to some Russian hardware news. So the Russian MOD has stated that the first batch of its new 2S-35 Kalitsias, the SPGs, have finally been sent to Ukraine. Now this paper tiger, much like the Armata tank, has dealt with a slow and painful development and testing phase for years, which has likely been due to stripped funding, not only from Russian military budgets, but also from military contract or contractor corruption, because of all of that funding misappropriation that we know and love Russia for. And so the biggest issues with the introduction of this half-tested and rushed to the front line piece of equipment is that apart from the cost and complexity and complete lack of training, it reportedly has very poor armor and will be just as vulnerable to Ukrainian FPV drone attacks as anything else, like that of the Russian T-90M tanks. So I would expect that Russia or the Russian army to be drip-fed, at best, a few of these per month to the front lines. Meanwhile, on the Ukrainian front, guess what's been kicking butt at the front lines for quite some time now? Ukraine's in-house developed Bodana SPGs, and Ukraine has over 30 of these in service now and continues to build them. Then moving across to some economy news. So as expected, the Russian central bank has increased their interest rates another full percent to 16%. And Russia's continued invasion of Ukraine is highly likely to negatively impact the outlook for the Russian economy. Imports have risen faster than exports, likely contributing to the ruble depreciation since the start of the war, which is another driver of inflation within Russia, forcing them to increase their central bank rates as always to attempt to curb inflation. So, in a sentence, this is the story of the going downhill of the Russian economy, which is the most heavily sanctioned country on earth, by a long shot. It's almost painful to watch. Then in some other news, NATO will be conducting its largest military drills in decades with 90,000 troops from late January to May. And in fact, these drills will be the biggest since the Cold War. So these drills will simulate the need for European military readiness in the event of an attack from a, quote, near-peer adversary, without specifying Russia by name. And yes, I do now see the irony of calling Russia a near-peer adversary, we all do, but it's not exactly Russia's military prowess or lack thereof that concerns me as much as it is their lack of military intelligence, causing them to mistakenly open military conflicts from which there is little going back. So they need to be kept in check. I think I also just described a tantrum-throwing 4-year-old as well. Then moving across to something a little bit lighter, here's a quick video of a Ukrainian defender filming his trip back home with his 2 new kittens. 2 gingers. I'm guessing no doubt these ones were from the front line. Then moving across to a super quick funny to round it all off today, guys. So remember that very well publicized Bradley M2 tank shooting the absolute crap out of the Russian T-90M tank with its 25mm Bushmaster autocannon in the last, just a few days ago, really? Well, even though there's irrefutable full-length video footage, proof of that battle outcome, it didn't stop Russian state media from doing what they always do. So, according to the Russian news website Sagrad, the T-90M came out victorious in the combat. And apparently, as their story goes, the Bradley was shooting at the tank for 10 minutes straight, but lost the battle. And that, my friends, that's my classic Russia right there. The Russia I know and love. Egos so big, they're unable to accept any defeat or learn from any of their mistakes. That's our Russia. So thanks again for watching, guys. Please continue to like, comment, and subscribe. Almost hit the 100k. Probably be bugging you a lot less once that happens. I did promise that previously, so absolutely will. And yeah, thanks again. And I do hope to see all of you guys there in the next one. Cheers.